I think solar will win in global primary energy. I think it will dominate global primary energy in the latter half of this century.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. On September 10th, the three of us recorded a live webinar, just the host this time, on what might be the most important and disruptive trend in global energy transition: the rise of solar power. We asked whether solar has already won, what's driving its rapid ascent, and what it all means for energy production and policy here in Canada. And most importantly, this marks Sarah's first show back after being away all of last season for breast cancer treatment. We're thrilled to have her back and kicking off the episode with a primer on the pretty stunning growth of solar to date. Now here's the show. Without any further ado, Sarah, you're back. We're so glad for it. As listeners know, you were away all of last season while treating breast cancer, something you've been pretty open about. And, people want to know, how are you doing now?
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for all the well wishes and support. I decided to be really open about it because it was someone being open about it that helped me to get screening and detect the issue before it became even worse. So I'm doing pretty well. I'm still in treatment. There's parts that continue for quite a lot longer than I think I ever realized. But on the whole, I'm getting stronger, and I'm really looking forward to being back with you guys. So happy to be here.
Well, that's great. And did the time away from teaching and the general energy wonkery give you any sort of extra perspective on the work we do or just on life generally?
Yeah, I think it's unavoidable, right? When you sort of confront something like this, you start to think about life and its finiteness to some extent. Part of it also shows how I think we all have our individual ways of approaching things. So I did my own reading and found quite an interesting book on the whole history of development and industrial policy behind the chemotherapy drug that I was taking. So that was quite fascinating to learn about, the discovery of it from this bark in the Pacific Northwest and all the various challenges that were faced with government agencies having to collect enough of it and communicating between different government agencies and all these parts. So I think it's interesting how we often look for sort of similar ways to connect with whatever it is that we're going through. And I guess for me, that's through industrial policy and trying to understand where things come from.
Yeah, so not a full break from the energy wonkery, but just a little bit of a tangent. And now that you're back and, you, David, and I have had a chance to huddle and sort of look at the upcoming season, what are you most looking forward to?
Well, I don't want to spoiler too much all the things that we're going to be talking about, but
then people won't show up.
But I guess to some extent, it's really just how there continues to be so much to talk about, right? And so many things going on and so much change. And, despite all of the many, many challenges and the, easy way it is on a day-to-day basis to feel like, things are all kind of going in the wrong direction, when I take a step back and look at some of the energy and climate challenges, I do feel some optimism around, steps that we've made, at least compared to looking backwards. So that's kind of refreshing in a way.
Well, that's great. And I share your optimism, but I'm afraid that not enough people do these days, I guess, with all the things that are going wrong in the world. But let's talk about something that I think is optimistic, and it's a pretty big question. Today, we're talking about, has solar won compared to other forms of electricity generation? Is it dominating those other forms? What drove its spectacular rise, and whether it can really power the bulk or a very significant chunk of electricity in the future? Or, as always, are we going to suffer from grid bottlenecks or land constraints, or just plain old physics getting in the way? And at the end of that, we will, as we always do, zoom into Canada and discuss the implications for our local grids here. But to mark Sarah's triumphant return, she's going to open with a global primer on the growth of solar to date. And we're going to take the first 10 minutes or so. After that, David's going to weigh in with a few comments around where solar is headed. And just before we get to Q&A, I'll bring us back to that discussion about implications for Canada. And before we turn the floor to Sarah, David, anything that you want to say up front?
Just totally great to have Sarah back. I'm excited, and I'm excited we're going to do a bunch of group chats like this.
All right, Sarah, over to you.
Great. So I did my homework because, of course, things are constantly changing in the solar space. I teach a class actually when I'm usually back on campus on the principles of solar. And it's a great class, but the only problem is that every year I have to go back and update a big chunk of slides because so much has changed. Doesn't quite happen in a lot of other sectors. So when we talk about solar domination, I mean, off the top, I guess I will acknowledge, at least when I think about solar domination, it's really about the growth and it's about where we're going to get to rather than the idea that solar is somehow dominating the power sector today. So the one sort of sobering statistic I'll start with is that in 2024, 7% of the global energy generation, so actually the electricity produced, not the capacity of power sources, but the electricity produced, 7% of it came from solar. Now, you can look at that and be pessimistic and say, well, 7%, that's not very much. But if you go back not very long ago, in 2012, that number was 0%. So there was some solar, but it rounded down to 0. So we're basically sort of at, I think, the beginning of this domination in growth turning into potentially, we're going to debate domination in generation, but we're at the beginning. That said, the growth is just, staggering, right? And I tried to come up with the best ways to say just how much solar is growing other than just saying, wow, it's growing by a lot. One interesting stat is thinking about just how quickly that growth is accelerating. So it took, if we go from, say, the time of the first commercially available solar cell in the 1950s and fast forward all the way to 2022, it took, around 70 years to install the first terawatt of capacity of solar. And the next terawatt was installed in the following 2 years. So in 2023 and 2024, we globally installed as much solar as we ever had in the history of solar. And if you go back even further, of course, the theory behind how a solar panel works goes all the way back to 1905. So I think that's actually also kind of interesting, too, when we talk about how fast solar is growing. This idea, can energy transitions be fast? It always depends when you start the clock. And so, it's not totally untrue to say, well, it's been somewhat slow. It took us 68 years to get here, but I think we are now here. And there's really no sign of slowing down. So in the first 6 months of 2025, we had 380 gigawatts, so a little bit more than a third of a terawatt of new solar capacity. And that was already 64% higher than during the same period in 2024. So 2023, 2024, we installed more solar than we ever had before. And on this year, we're on track to be above 2024 by another 64%. And so, if you kind of continue this sort of trajectory between 2024 and 2030, solar is expected to account for 80% of the growth in global renewable capacity. So it's really clearly dominating over wind and hydropower and others. And that will get it to the point that by the end of this decade, in 5 years, solar PV would be the largest renewable source, more than both wind and hydropower. And so how did we get there? Let me just quickly jump to that. I mean, at a top line, basically, the costs of solar have fallen by 90% in the last decade and more than 99% since the 1970s. So, this just massive, massive cost declines. Again, I did a little bit of back of the envelope to try to figure out, how that compared to something else we might think about and be more familiar with, which is computers. And it's actually pretty similar. I mean, it depends on what's in that 99%. But if you look at the first personal computer, which was available actually the year that I was born, you get about a 99% cost decline in terms of the cost of the same amount of computing power. And both of those were really advanced through something people often refer to as deployment-led innovation. And so this is a little bit different. It's not just learning by doing. So let me just explain a couple of the things that drove that. There were really two parts of the solar cost decline. And there's some interesting work that's been done on this by Jessica Transick and others back in 2018, where they really tried to decompose different drivers of cost decline of solar. And there's really kind of two periods for that. So there's like the early period of the kind of 1980s to mid 2010s, where the biggest cost decline actually came from increasing the efficiency of solar modules. So if you have a solar module and it's 20% efficient at converting the sunlight to power and you make that 23% efficient, you actually, basically reduce the cost of solar generation in that way. And so the biggest part during that time was really about, kind of doing a better job with making these solar panels. And a lot of that came from R&D funding, both, a bit of private and some government. And then after the early 2000s, however, it was really the scale economies that became more significant in cost reductions. And so there you get things like policies that stimulate market growth, so subsidization or regulations that lead to a lot more solar being deployed. And there you get some of this, kind of learning by doing, but actually in the case of solar, a lot of also scale economies. So basically bigger and bigger factories means lower and lower costs.
Yeah, well, I just want to, so that's interesting, those two studies. And I immediately think of Greg Nemeth, whom we had on the show a few years ago, a professor at University of Wisconsin, who talked about sort of the baton passing that happened around solar, and that speaks to your scale issue. A bit analogous to wind, like what really caused wind prices to fall in the early days. And it was originally because of, efficiency gains, like growth in the length of blades or taller towers that allow you to get to better and more consistent wind. Since then, there's been, some benefits from, enhanced algorithmic planning that dictates when they're online or offline. But really, so what you're saying, just bringing back to solar, it's that factories in China in particular, and thinking of Greg Nemeth's baton passing across countries, is that factories in China are printing solar like they're pieces of paper right now. They're just churning them out. Is that kind of the right conclusion?
Yeah, I think so. Or like their computers. Jenny Chase from BNEF, talks about it's not necessarily great to be in the solar module production business, right? Printing these solar panels is not necessarily a high margin business. And indeed, you just make these factories bigger and bigger. You get more efficient, you get less waste. There was some benefit that the solar industry got sort of spillover from the computing industry. So, some of the techniques and costs coming down for the silicon in general there that kind of helped that. But I think it is interesting that there really were these two parts though, right? It's not just that we started making a lot of it and you got this big economies of scale. You actually had to early on do some R&D to, get better at making these things.
Yeah, I personally don't buy the computer analogy very much. Computers benefit because you're printing in 2D. And so when you decrease the feature size, you get a square in the number of parts. And so I think the way the computer lithography works and the challenge of the really big lithographic systems feels to me kind of deeply different. I think to me, the analogy is to other things that are complicated to manufacture, but you fundamentally manufacture at one place in a repeatable way at giant scale. So yes, it's true that very early on there was this connection with the silicon supply line, but that's way in the past. They're not really divided things. And I think it's really that the ability to make the solar modules and the ways that economies of learning have worked for that kind of very centralized production. And then separately, of course, it's all the really extraordinary learnings in shaking down the cost of installation and cleaning and so on. So the overall, the very kind of cheapest projects that went in last year, say some in the Gulf, are around $0.50 an installed watt direct current. And that's module prices are only a piece of that. That's the overall project cost. And there's been a huge amount of learning on how to make the racks cheaper, how to automate the installation, how to do the cleaning, how to do the interconnects. And all those things, again, I think the key thing is they're not very site specific. So once you do that innovation in one place, it applies everywhere. And in that sense, it's deeply different than some of the ways that hydro works or geothermal is likely to work, which is, I think, why solar is likely to win.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you there. And I think the computer analogy for me is less about the similarity in the way the costs come down, but more just the idea that, it is amazing what solar has done, but it's not the only technology that we're familiar with that has had that kind of cost reduction. And I also very strongly agree on the what you're saying about the manufacturing. And I forgot to look up the reference. We'll put it in the show notes. But, there's sort of was a theory put forward, and actually I'm doing some work on it with a colleague at UCalgary, Sean McCoy, and a student of ours, looking at, can you actually look at technologies and try to figure out, how, are they more like solar, or are they more like, nuclear or something that hasn't seen these kind of cost declines? And one of the big features, the original paper, talked about sort of qualitatively this idea of, on the one hand, level of complexity. And in particular, it's sort of, well, you can say a solar panel is, of course, complex at a molecular level, but then it gets, it gets printed, it gets made in a machine, not printed, but made in a machine, and built. And then it's very, very simple, right? As you say, like when you go see a big solar plant, it's impressive because a big solar installation, I should say, it's impressive because it spans a large amount of space, but it's also striking how simple it is, right? It's just a bunch of sticks with these panels attached and a bit of wires between them all. And compare that to, touring a natural gas plant, which is fascinating. I got the chance to do that to a plant here in Calgary. And it's like, there's just so much going on. There's tubes and things everywhere. And so that, on the one hand, that level of complexity. And then on the other hand, again, along, I think what you were saying, they talked about this idea of customization, right? So again, a solar plant, and the terminology is confusing here, but a solar installation somewhere is, takes the same panels, whether it's being made, anywhere around the world, and they basically are installed, more or less in the same way. And there's very, very few things that have that level of, just standardization that the same thing is going to work, essentially everywhere.
Part of it is about the plant that makes the plant. So the point is that not only is solar modules are obviously modular, but the machines that make them are modular. And there's just not, for reasons that maybe aren't obvious, or maybe we don't know, there's not a bottleneck in the same way there are, say, for gas turbine blades, these incredibly special, with crystalline specialized steel with ceramic coatings. And there's just a very few extremely specialized factories in the world that make these things. And for various reasons, it's very slow to rebuild these factories. It's just really different than the way solar is.
Mm-hmm. I will offer one caution when we say that solar is simple, because I've said the same. I said it's just steel, glass, and wires. I remember having this conversation with Dawn Farrell when she was running TransAlta. She's just been in the news recently because she's been tapped by the Carney government to head up the new major projects office that will implement all those nation-building projects. But I said, well, surely then it defies the bathtub curve relative to a coal plant or a combined cycle natural plant. And if viewers can see, I'm tracing with my finger a curve that is a U, and that U is the decline over the majority of the life of that asset. It's expensive at first, and then it's expensive at the tail end. And she said, why would you say that? Because even without those moving parts, it features roughly the same cost curve, OPEX curve. And of course, in this province now, we've got so much debate around end of life, what we're going to do with all those solar panels once they hit their end of life. But we'll save that for the part 3 of our conversation. Maybe, David, turning to you, because you just said solar is likely to win. But maybe you could define that. Like, where will solar win and how will solar win?
When I say that I think solar will win, I'm making a prediction. And as you know, predictions are hard, especially about the future, as Yogi Berra said. But here's my prediction, not just mine, obviously. I think solar will win in global primary energy. I think it will dominate global primary energy in the latter half of this century. And I want to spend some time saying why. So first of all, by primary energy, I don't just mean electricity. I mean all the energy that goes commercially to drive our civilization. And I think at this point, in my view, it's really likely that solar will win. So first of all, to me, win means winner takes most. If you look at energy history, it's never winner takes all. There's always niches. So win doesn't mean solar's 99%, but win means solar will be by a large margin, maybe like 2/3 the biggest. So if you had to make a specific guess, I'd guess that by late this century, good chance solar's 2/3 or something of global primary energy, a really big fraction. So I want to say a little bit about why. First of all, just to give you a sense of where things are now. So some of the cheapest projects gone in the last while, like Al Dafra in Abu Dhabi, half 50 cents per watt DC. That has a PPA power purchase agreement price of something like $1.30 a kilowatt hour, which just to convert it would be the equivalent of about $3.70. This is US dollars per gigajoule. And thinking about that in terms of, say, gas supply, and it's an unfair comparison, but in a way that favors solar, Henry Hub gas prices now, the North American trade price is at around 3, but in India markets, in Europe markets, and in China markets, we're looking at more like 10 for imports, or vary. Some of those are a little bit lower. But of course, that's for gas. But what we ultimately want mostly is not heat. It's easy to turn gas into heat, but turning gas into some product or into power or shaft power, you've got the conversion losses that are more than 50% for gas turbines. And so that gives you a sense of how already solar is competing. Now, of course, viewers will be screaming, but solar is intermittent. It's only during the day. That's absolutely true. But I think there are a bunch of ways that there really is a path to manage daily variability, and we'll get to that. And I think we'll get to the Canadian side too. I think especially in places that have very good insulation, in near the tropical belt, we really aren't looking at much seasonal variability. It's really just diurnal variability, and there really are ways to manage it. So let me give you a little more sense of why I think it will win by comparing it to some of the other primary energy technologies. So first of all, solar versus wind. Again, I don't think it'll be winner takes all. There's places where wind is really great and they're anti-correlated, but I think there's some basic ways. One of them is land use. Solar produces an average of something like 10 watts per square meter, can be a little bit better, on an annual average basis of power. Wind power is more like half a watt per square meter over the wind turbine array, and wind turbines have environmental and climate impacts. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do wind, but to give you a sense of scale, you can power all of our civilization on something like 0.5% to 1% of the global land surface area. With wind power, if you want to cover all of our civilization, you basically have to cover the planet with wind turbines, and you have big environmental impacts. So I think there's some way in which it just doesn't scale. So that's versus wind. Versus hydro, the absolute cap, if you get all the hydro in the world, is a few terawatts. And so you're just not going to grow it very much. Current primary power is something getting up towards 20 terawatts. There's no version of the world where hydro grows significantly. Of course, people like me hope we dismantle hydro plants and it shrinks. Solar versus biomass, just to say it, the land use and environmental constraints are incredible. Biomass is less than half a watt per square meter into primary energy in a useful way. There's just no version of it. And I keep going back to land because land is the one resource that doesn't change. Technology can keep improving, and innovation can, say, as we've seen in batteries, shift you from needing a lot of cobalt to not needing it. There's lots of ways we can do that, but there's no innovation that makes more land on Earth. We may get off planet, but there's a fixed amount of land on Earth, or pretty much a fixed amount of land on Earth. Solar versus geothermal, I think we can come back to this in detail, but I think there are a bunch of reasons that make it very hard for me to imagine a similar scaling of geothermal. There's some inherent well drilling costs as a very well developed technology, and also inherently low energy per well that has consequences for how that will scale, even if the rest of the system gets very cheap. I think the one exception is nuclear. So to me, if it's not dominantly solar, it's dominantly nuclear. I've long thought that the likely outcome for the world is some combination of those two. I think nuclear obviously has the advantage of even higher energy density, so even smaller land footprint, and it's dispatchable. Right now, the costs of adding new capacity are much cheaper for solar than nuclear, but I think if solar doesn't end up winning late this century, it's because nuclear won. But I think at this point, it's very likely that solar wins. And I think the other part of it is really something about the structure of how easy it is to do big projects. It just doesn't take very long because they're so similar place to place. And a related piece is, of course, what solar wants to make is direct current power, which naturally connects to what electrolysis or batteries want to either store power or make products. And those are places where we see innovation chugging along, and have every reason to believe it will chug along for some of the same reasons that we believe innovation will work for solar. So I think when you put those together, I really do think it's likely that you will see solar be the cheap way to do things that have high energy costs, and that will drive long-term industry to places where solar is cheap.
David, I'd like to go back to a couple of the comparisons that you did. Get it with hydro, get it with wind. There'll be a different story when we talk about wind here in Canada, or I'll put forward a different story. But solar versus geothermal and solar versus nuclear. So one thing I think about geothermal is that's going in its favor is, frankly, the U.S. and the U.S. absolutely losing the solar battle. Not that it was ever really in the battle. China is just dominating exports. But given the involvement of drilling wells and hydraulic fracturing, creating loop symptoms and suitable geology, that is one area where I could see the U.S. really taking a step forward and carrying that baton in the way that California carried the baton for solar panels going back a couple decades. And there are companies like Evor that are making a lot of gains. And as I say, it ties into what is left of the Trump climate administration strategy because it really makes use of the know-how in the oil and gas industry. So maybe you said it's hard to imagine scaling in a similar way in low energy per well. Maybe you could expand on that.
So there's some nice calculations that Nate Lewis did. I've redone them a few times. But yeah, if you look at the actual total energy you extract per well over a lifetime for geothermal wells, it's surprisingly small in terms of like the number of gigajoules you get over a lifetime. That has something to do. And of course, every well has while drilling costs can go down, there are going to be costs associated with completing those wells and with managing that perforation through the earth that I just don't see kind of going away in the same way because of the way geology varies. Geology is variable in a way that land surface is not. So that again, you're not likely to get that kind of standardization. And then you got the fact that when you drill down there, what you get is low-grade heat. And low-grade heat is just not very valuable in some deep ways. A part of this is really the Carnot efficiency of going from low-grade heat to anything you want. You can't move low-grade heat around efficiently. These are kind of deep, basic reasons of physics and energy science that have absolutely nothing to do with what the U.S. policy happens to be now. I don't disagree with you. There may be a big U.S. push on geothermal, but so what? I think these things are shaped by large-scale forces of what is actually technologically easy and hard and how that evolves because of the physics of the problem.
David, as you started with, right, it's not winner takes all, right? So Ed, to your question, I do think there will be an important role for geothermal in addition. But when you talk about, you sort of think about the bulk of the energy, where is that going to come from? And there, I agree with David. I think it's very hard to see anything beating solar, on a cost basis. Part of also when you think about that land use, it goes back a little bit, I think, to the basic physics of this energy is coming to the earth first in the form of the sun, right? So like the wind essentially is a form of sun energy that's been converted through, the sun acting on
0.3% efficiency or less.
Exactly. And so that's the issue, right? So like there is a sort of nice basic physics, as you were saying, to it all. And nuclear is a bit the exception because, of course, then you're sort of making maybe your own sun or at least your own nuclear bonds here. But all the others, whether it's wind or biomass, you're converting them all through some process from the original sun energy. And so, we're probably better off getting the sun energy and just using it directly.
Let me say more what I mean by low-grade heat. Ed, if I give you a infinite source, any amount you want of 3,000 degree centigrade heat, you're the richest human in the world. Like you just have like basically infinite cheap energy. You can make contracts for things that will turn that energy into power and products, and you'll be the king of the world. If I give you an infinite source of heat at 100 degrees C, yeah, maybe you'll be a little richer than you are now, but it's just not going to do much. You're going to like heat your neighbors' houses, and you can't even make a generator that will be competitive or barely based on that. And it's just the Carnot law. There's some intermediate. Yes, it's true that if you drill very deep, you're getting hot enough that you're just barely starting to make it. But it feels like you just got to turn a bunch of knobs to 11 and they barely cross.
How do you compare, David, when, again, solar dominating primary energy supply, the grid bottleneck issue? Because solar, it is going to be, there are optimal solar locations, there are suboptimal solar locations, and the one difference compared to big centralized power, whether it be combined cycle natural gas, and put aside the climate problem for a second, or advanced nuclear, which it feels like, and I know people are always saying this, no matter where you are in history, advanced nuclear is just 10 years away. But with China now producing nuclear at $3,000 per watt, it seems like we are on the cusp. And that isn't as location specific, provided, of course, you can get the plutonium to where you need it.
Sure. So first of all, I mean, just to be glib, nuclear power by some measures has got almost 10 times cheaper if you compare the current cost of the Chinese builds to the cost of the worst U.S. builds of 2 decades ago. It is actually roughly a factor of 10. But so that you can try to cherry pick these comparisons to get what you want. I don't know what you mean by advanced nuclear. I mean, what China's doing is basically the Westinghouse AP1000 design and its variants, and that is increasingly becoming a global standard, which is really exciting. And I think it is a good design. And I'm really kind of optimistic about it, but I think the issue is really ability to build those things at speed and the cost of doing it, and the fact that the proliferation risks are unavoidable. You build those supply chains, and you've made ways to make weapons. For grid, I think there's 2 answers. One answer is that there's more ability if you set markets in place. There's more ability to have demand shifting than I think we think. I just came back from a really exciting set of meetings in India. I was in Delhi and Kochi last week, and India, as many people know, has had this kind of revolutionary change in the way they did finance by having government set up a kind of uniform payment architecture that was really a system, a standard that everybody could play into. They are very seriously talking about doing the same for electricity in a way that would really leap far ahead of what we have in North America, really allowing much more effective markets between supply and demand. And, you can already see, say, in India, where there's very cheap solar power going in, there are people really thinking about how to make demand variable. So that's true for water pumping, for agriculture, and a bunch of other uses more than you think. So obviously it involves storing heat, storing cold, shifting demand around. So I think there's just more of that than you think once you make the market do it. And the second thing is, I was always skeptical about this too. I think batteries really are on a path to get cheaper as well. I mean, the Chinese are now built some very large grid-connected battery storage. The cheapest one I found is just over $100 a kilowatt hour. That's not the cost of a battery. That's the cost of a whole installation on the grid. This is an installation that's got half a gigawatt of peak power. That just is something I couldn't have imagined a few years ago, and it's real. And you look at now the progress towards, for example, sodium-ion batteries, where they're going to be commercialized for vehicles, but it looks like they're going to be even better for grid storage. There's a bunch of other battery chemistries that seem like they'll work. I think it's going to be slower. But the point is, once you're down to about $100 a kilowatt hour, you're in spitting distance of where you can actually start to manage diurnal variability at a competitive price.
Yeah, and we see that happening, right? More and more solar projects that are getting built in the U.S. are basically just being built with batteries from the start, right? Whereas that was not common before. The transmission thing, I think it's also a different question talking about where you're, depending on where you're looking at, right? So we have different issues, say in Canada compared with, say, India, or I saw a really striking set of graphs. I think it was Ember that published them a couple days ago that was looking at what happened over the last year or so across Africa in terms of solar. And so, sort of as a knock-on effect from the U.S. Putting this big tariff on Chinese solar panels, those panels have had to find another place to go. And one of the places that they have found is many African countries, both, South Africa, the ones that were already doing solar installations, but perhaps even more striking was like it's not even a hockey stick graph. It's like a literally straight up in the air graph of places like Algeria and Botswana and others. You can't even imagine what a difference that is in terms of solar. And there, you can also, especially in countries that are getting a reliable amount of sun on a regular basis and are, say, building up from perhaps a less reliable electricity system, then solar panels are a great way to, move forward your electricity system, because you don't have to build out necessarily a lot of really expensive and hard to maintain infrastructure. I think there are some similarities there with, what happened with the mobile phones kind of leapfrogging whatever we call wired phones, exactly, because you don't need that kind of infrastructure in place. It is a very different story depending, in terms of variability. If you're trying to replace power that's already not particularly reliable, then getting some local solar and potentially some batteries is a huge opportunity there. And that's just one example of, where the geopolitics plays in, right? So we've talked about why solar, I think we sort of kind of agree why solar is likely to win from a physics standpoint and a, sort of pure energy standpoint. But I think there's also some really strong reasons why from a geopolitics standpoint, it's come so far. And I mean, China is, really dominating the world in all kinds of ways in producing the solar, but also installing it. And I think a big part of that for them and for other countries that are looking at that opportunity is, of course, energy, independence, right? And not relying on imports from other countries, not being subject to the kind of price volatility that can happen with LNG and others as well. And so there's a big kind of additional pressure in that direction. And when you think about something, like the U.S., and whether or not you say, okay, they've lost on solar because they're not manufacturing it there, it's, yes, there is still vulnerabilities if you are completely reliant on a single country for solar manufacturing. I don't think that's a good idea. But it is a different kind of energy security question when you're talking about installing infrastructure that's going to last for a while versus needing to purchase fuel that is immediately, going into a power plant and burning up, and you have to buy the fuel again the next day. I don't want to make it sound too simple because, of course, if you're going to grow your solar power plants, you're going to need to continue to install more solar, but it doesn't have the same kind of sort of very short-term energy security threats that relying, entirely on another country for the fuel, does.
Yeah, I mean, we're saying not at all. I mean, China's dominating and building cheap solar, but I don't think there's some intrinsic reason why that's true. If for some reason there was a geopolitical block, the underlying knowledge of how to build cheap solar is there, and there'd be some prices will go up for a while until some other country figure out how to do it cheaply. In that sense, it's completely different from a resource like, really cheap gas or oil, which is actually geographically tied to a place.
Yeah. And with the China issue, we have that supply chain risk when we depend on China, and we also have the tariff risk. And you're right, David, I think another country could pick it up. But in the meantime, I think it would be highly damaging to the solar industry and perhaps at a critical time. But going back to China, given that it's installing, gigawatts of new solar, that 50% of its vehicle fleet rolling off of assembly lines today is electrified, whether it's 4 wheels or 2 wheels. Are we seeing China becoming the first electro state, and at a time when the U.S. is moving back, it's retrenching, becoming a petro state? And what does that say for that competition to produce and own primary energy use? What does that say about the China-U.S. war?
I think some of this is more that you're right to say it. It captures the zeitgeist, but I don't think that the U.S. is really becoming more a petrostate. And yes, it's true, stunningly, that Chinese electric vehicle sales are now 50%, more than 50% of all cars in China by new sales. That's a big deal, and I think that's an important shift. But I don't really see. It's not like the U.S. is slowing down substantially in development of solar installations because there's a big demand for new power.
Yeah, I think China is becoming, I think it's fair to say China is becoming the first electric state, right? And it is electrifying its use of energy much faster than anywhere else. But I agree with you, David. I don't think it's a reversion in the US. And Canada too. It's a slowdown, right? And so I agree. It's a little bit of an overstatement, but it is a diverging paths in terms of like China's going quickly in one direction and the US is going very slowly towards it. And it is that, you mentioned it, but it's that I think has a lot to do with that resource. Like, where is the resource for fossil fuel? And that's only in certain places versus the solar, which, is sort of everywhere with some, we can get into that a little bit, but it is, I think that is also going to be hard to sort of get away from.
Yeah. And I guess it's so yes, to your point, David and Sara, so the U.S. is installing massive amounts of solar. And I heard Jesse Jenkins, whom we had on the show last season, say on Ezra Klein about decarbonization, along with Jane Flagle, is that 95% of new electricity going into the United States is some combination of solar and batteries, and wind as well. However, you look at actual exports of, say, solar panels or solar equipment, I think the U.S., produces something minuscule like tens of millions on an annual basis, whereas you have the China producing now tens of billions. So it is entirely ceded that part of the supply chain. While, and sure, it's not a petrostate, but if anything, it's doubled down on oil and gas as being that winner in primary energy.
Yeah, agreed. I think I do want to switch. We're going to talk about Canada to distribution. I really do think solar looks much better when you're close to the equator. So, first of all, if you just look at maps of insolation, you'll find that the best places in Canada, which are kind of southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, are like 40, depending on exactly how you're doing the installation and how you're thinking tilts and stuff. On an annual average basis, they're 30 or 40% worse, let's say, than the best places in the world in the Gulf or in Western China or whatever. 30, 40% is a big deal if you're competing to make some primary energy commodity. But that understates how bad it is, because in Canada, you have this huge seasonal variability, not picking Canada out, anywhere that's far from the equator. And so managing that variability, that seasonal variability, is really not easy. Whereas managing that is getting batteries that are cheap enough to manage the seasonal variability tells you've got to have battery prices that are coming down not to $100 a kilowatt hour, more like to $10 a kilowatt hour or something like that. It's really hard. Whereas if you're thinking about the Gulf states or China with its extremely good solar resource in the West, or India, which has got great solar resources in Rajasthan area, for example, or other states like that, they have access both to cheap solar and to cheap solar that doesn't have much seasonal variability, which means that managing the variability is doable with technologies that are coming online, both for demand management and batteries. And I think that means that Canada is disadvantaged.
Well, I think it is. I completely agree with you, David. It's disadvantaged, and solar is not necessarily winning in Canada. Now, I will say, so solar it went through this tremendous growth spurt, particularly here in Alberta. When you look at the data from 2019, there was 85 to 100 megawatts of installed capacity in Alberta. That grew to 1,800 megawatts by the end of 2023. Now, you contrast that. There are 5,700 megawatts of wind capacity in Alberta. Overall, though, if you look at the picture in Canada and procurement across the country, it tends to be wind that's still winning. BC had a procurement recently that 9 projects were awarded. All of them were wind. Solar was added later after one of them dropped out. Saskatchewan procures a lot more wind than solar, and it's on the order of, say, 300 megawatts to 100 megawatts of solar. And when you come back to one of the reasons for it, why it's losing is while governments are going for lowest cost instead of best value. And I think in optimal locations like Alberta, solar provides best value because it generates it when we need that power more likely. The way governments are procuring is going for lowest cost. And if you look at that spectacular rise we had in Alberta, it was largely on the backs of corporate PPAs, the Amazons of the world buying these virtual PPAs, and those have sort of sputtered, and especially since the provincial government put a moratorium on new solar development. They've lifted that, but it really checked the growth. So bottom line is that solar is not winning in Canada, and I don't think it's likely to win, but wind is certainly coming on very strong and continues to.
And I think this comes back to what you mean by winning, right? So again, strongly agree with the seasonal challenges. I'm less worried about the overall insulation, given the costs of solar panels becoming so cheap. I think that, if it was only about having a 30 to 40% less total sunlight, we would be doing okay here in Alberta. But as you say, David, and as some work that I've done with Christina Pearson, we looked at, just how hard it is to meet, close to 100% of Alberta's power with solar, right? Because it's just, we have those short days in the winter. But that doesn't mean that, same with winning doesn't mean taking all, not winning doesn't mean taking none, right? So there's a sort of loser takes some, I think, solar in Canada, which is that, it can contribute, some not insignificant amount to our annual power at low cost. And so I think it's just important to note that piece that it's not none. Until I didn't tell you yet, David, about my geoengineering idea, which is we change the tilt of the axis of the Earth so that we get rid of this seasonality problem with solar. So you heard it here first.
Excellent plan. I'm all in.
Extreme terraforming plans.
I mean, a really basic fact, which you haven't mentioned, is, of course, if you look at a map of global wind capacity and global solar capacity, they're almost anti-correlated. Like the really great wind sites are basically southern Argentina completely rocks. And, Angava's good. And actually UK is really good. And that's, those, I kind of listed some of the good places in the world. It's of Australia. And solar is really good in the broad tropical belt where most people live and where the big centers of global population or growing global population are, which is another reason I think it will win. I guess one caveat that's important in the near term, again, it's winner takes most, is the best sites for building things on really cheap carbon-free power are sites where wind and solar have daily anti-correlations. Like Namibia has examples like that, where you can build both and without any storage get very high capacity factors. And there are definitely businesses going after that who want access to cheap energy.
Now it comes back to coming back to Canada again and policymakers. So if really it's wind that is winning, and so in a solar takes most competition globally, solar is going to play a much smaller role in Canada than if you're Mark Carney's New Energy Czar and you see solar as winner takes most globally. What do you do about it here in Canada? What's your solar strategy? Or is it basically do nothing?
In the great tradition of like everybody puts their new strategy for a new government just being the strategy that they always like, but couched in those terms, I would say, build a lot of transmission across Canada. That's going to enable some more solar and some more wind. I think trying to get into the solar manufacturing business would really be foolhardy in a lot of ways, right? And I don't know that there's a really serious discussion about that anymore in Canada. But I do think, doing those kind of big things of building that transmission and setting out a sort of plan towards and mandate for low carbon power remains good things to do.
I think Canada's strategy's got to figure out what the strategy is for. Is the strategy about decarbonizing, or is the strategy about the fact that Canada has, Canada productivity growth has been really slow, and Canada has a real economic challenge, and we have to figure out things that produce big value added that grow the Canadian economy. I think those are different problems and with different answers.
Let's get to questions. All right, I've got one from Phil Duguay. Of course, his boss at Grid United, Michael Skelly, was on the show. Gosh, it's going back, I want to say fall of 2023. He says, "Hi, gang. Welcome back, Sara. I recently attended a lecture from a leading U.S.-based expert on solar providing synthetic inertia to grids as an ancillary reliability service. He said grids' anachronistic grid codes are inhibiting this service. His remarks diffuse a lot of the common criticism about the technology. Are you folks tracking this? If so, please comment."
So maybe just really briefly for listeners. So grid inertia is something that we have on the electricity grid in the way that it has historically operated. It's like the word sounds, inertia. It's basically big spinning masses that tend, once in motion, to keep going. And without getting too deep into the electronics of that all, that, helps to keep things stable on the grid. And so there is a lot of concern that when you take away these big spinning masses, i.e. you take away your big turbines that are producing power from fossil fuels, and you replace it with so-called inverter-based systems. So you have, as David was saying, the solar panel that's producing DC power. You're inverting that to AC power. I'm getting flashbacks from E&M in college. It can introduce some vulnerabilities in your system because when a shock comes into the grid, it doesn't have this inertia to kind of keep it stable. That is the challenge. And, yes, it is completely true that is a challenge, and it's a challenge that we've always managed historically through inertia. There is the ability to manage it in other ways, and, power electronics can respond much more quickly than anything that we've ever had. So it's not an unsolvable problem at all. It's more of an issue of are our systems, are our markets set up in a way to integrate those technologies? And do we have the right checks and balances in place to make sure that the ones that get chosen are actually going to work? And I think underlying a lot of this is that we really had this necessary service, this inertia that we were sort of getting, for free, or just came without thinking about it. And now we have to start thinking about it. So without, this is almost like a whole debate that we could have around it. But I think it's a great example of, yes, this is something that we need to address. It is addressable by technology, but it is going to require thinking about those markets differently.
Maybe one quick summary, sort of complementary to what Sara said, is there's lots of time scales for electricity supply. So all this stuff is in this very short time scale, a time scale that is the frequency regulation time scale, if you like, kind of going from fractions of a second to minutes. And that time scale, there are problems. It's true that there are some particular problems, as Sara said, that solar raises, but they're absolutely fixable at a pretty tiny cost in terms of total costs. Whereas the costs regarding storage, especially seasonal diurnal storage, are not fixable at low price. They're inherently hard. Whereas the short-term things are fixable with the right regulation, with technology that exists now.
Let's go to Sonia Vinogradova. Can distributed energy generation work in Canada? If everyone puts solar on their houses, businesses, does this create a market challenge to traditional major energy companies? David, you infamously have called rooftop solar in residences green bling before, and equally infamously to a Solar Alberta Association conference, you said that we should just be running high voltage DC lines from optimal solar locations in Arizona to power Alberta instead of building anything here. So I suspect you have an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, if you care, to be clear, if people want to be totally self-sufficient and want to pay for it, knock yourselves out. And if you want to grow all your own food too, that's great as well. No problem. But it almost certainly isn't cost effective. Persistently, both the capital costs and the operating costs of rooftop solar on small buildings like residential homes are just not competitive with large scale solar. And so people should be free to do them, but I don't think we should give them special incentives. I think there are intermediate cases of solar on large warehouses where those prices actually do get closer to competitive and could make sense and do make sense in some places. But I think while there are individuals who really like the idea of total self-sufficiency, I really think that the U.S. national economy was right when it said that the grid was the greatest invention of the last century. And I don't think we're going to move away from it. I think most people want to be able to just buy grid power and be confident it's there. And I just don't think there's a big market for people putting it on their roofs.
Yeah, I don't totally disagree. Especially in a market like here in Alberta, right? If you're in other places, there's different considerations. But I think, as you say, it's something people can choose to do. It's, I would argue, better than spending that bling on a new granite countertop. And I do think it does open up a relationship with energy for people that is somewhat different. That said, I don't think that it's the start of then going off grid or something like that. But it's like many of the parts of this energy transition, it's a small contribution towards something that, but is all a sum of small contributions. But you're not going to get there with that alone.
Yeah, and you develop a very personal relationship with your own electricity generation when your inverter goes down, and you check and it's like, why, when I'm on this import-export contract with a utility, am I paying through the nose? And you look, oh, gee, my solar panels haven't been producing in the last 2 months because the inverter went kaput. I will say, though, my installer was very quick and very responsive to getting me a new inverter. And not to say that geothermal is problem-free either. This gets back to Don Farrell's point around the bathtub, that even though you don't have a lot of moving parts, there certainly are the OPEX. Martin Volker has a question. This will be our last question. I'm wondering about the pace of the solar revolution after reading Brett Christopher's The Price is Wrong. He argues renewables are not profitable enough, and profits is the only thing that counts. Just because the energy produced is very cheap doesn't guarantee build out.
I agree with that challenge, right? I think we've seen it being built out in some places because there is profitability potential. And there are many solar developers, across the US and Canada that have profited. But I think the broader underlying point that you can just sit back and say, well, obviously now the market is going to pick solar really doesn't acknowledge all the different challenges that kind of come in deciding what to build and who gets to decide. Why has Alberta built solar, but Saskatchewan largely hasn't? So maybe this is also a little bit of a preview for a show we're going to have later in the season where we talk about capitalism and the energy challenges and climate change too. So I'll save the rest of my comments there, but I think it's a very interesting point.
I'd say, again, going back to the big picture, if it's really cheap to make power and you can sell profitable products based on that energy, people will do it and make a profit. And I think that's what we're going to see with solar because of the kind of underlying forces that drive it.
Let's leave it at that. Sara, this is great. I feel like there's some real muscle memory between the three of us that we've been missing the last season. So much fun to have this conversation with you part of it.
Yeah, it's so much fun to be back. I look forward to more.
Great to have you back.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emmett Tanton. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our show from Season 2, Episode 3, called Solar in Alberta. What does it look like, and how do we manage it? It's an oldie but a goldie. We'll be back to talk the good, bad, and ugly of new energy tech on September 25th. See you then.